There we go. We have our orange ball. Okay, so we left off with regression analysis. We have a few more data mining models to cover. So, another one, correlations. Okay, so suppose we have this problem at a retail operation. We want to figure out what video game products tend to be bought together. So we identify there's a whole bunch of different categories of products we carry. And some of them get sold together, some of them don't. So we got consoles, we got controllers, got steering wheels, keyboards, games, whatever. So here's our data, over 1,000 purchases. Okay, and what we see here, these are all the things that were bought. So for example, out of these 1,000 purchases, down here in the corner, you can't see what I'm doing, down here in the corner, we see an 800. So 800 of those purchases, of those transactions involve somebody buying a new game. Oh, shit, where's my mug? I don't want to lose that. Oh. You only get one of these after you've been here for 10 years. That's a bonus. Anyway, likewise, 250 people bought consoles. Now, where they get interesting, these data, is on the intersection of different products. For example, right next to that 250 in the intersection of console with console, there's a 100. So that means 100 transactions had somebody buy both a console and a controller. Okay? And 40 transactions had people buy a console and a steering wheel. Okay? So there are a few key things we can pull out from all this data. Number one, support. Support is the simple probability that two items, X and Y, will be bought together. For example, if we look at consoles and controllers, the support for that is 10%, right? Out of our 1,000 transactions, 100 of them involve somebody buying both a console and a controller. And the point of support is a way of recognizing, hey, these are popular combinations. So if you're going to do advertising of saying, come to our store, these are the things we have, it doesn't make much point to make a big push for telling people you have consoles and keyboards where the number is only 10. Only 1% of your transactions are consoles and keyboards. If that's what you're leading with in your advertising, nobody's going to care. You're not selling that many of those things together. Okay, so it suggests grouping things. Another example, going to McDonald's, right? There's a reason why these items get packed together in value meals, because there are things that people buy together. Okay. Another one, confidence. Confidence is the conditional probability that Y will be bought given that X was bought. Okay, so that means, for example, if I know that somebody bought a console, for example, there's 250 people there that bought a console, of those, 40% bought a controller, right? Because 150 divided by 250 is 40%. Likewise, if I know that somebody bought, what's a good one? If I know that somebody bought a controller, right, probability of 300, 30%, only 1 in 10 of those bought a keyboard. So if I know that somebody bought a controller, the conditional probability that somebody bought a keyboard is 10%, 30 out of 300. So, confidence, the conditional probability that Y will be bought given that X was bought, it's a way of recognizing what two things are commonly bought together, right? So, the first one, support, that shows you in the scope of the whole operation how often things are bought together. But you can have a case, for example, where things are very often bought together, but they're not actually unusually common. For example, look at games versus consoles. So in the top row there, 250 people, 25% of your transactions involve a console. Of those, 80% involved a game, right? So 80% of the time, if somebody buys a console, they're also buying a game. That sounds really good. That sounds like, wow, that's really a strong correlation there. Until you go down here and you look, 80% of the transactions across the board involve a game. So even though there's a pretty high, support, right? 200 is not too bad. The confidence is actually pretty neutral. The fact that somebody bought a console doesn't actually tell you anything about whether they were more or less likely to buy a game. On the other hand, right? Keyboards are a pretty unlikely thing, right? Only 5% of the transactions, 50 out of 1,000, have people buying keyboards. But if you know that somebody bought a keyboard, you know that there's a 60% chance, right, 30 out of 50, that they also bought a controller. Those are things that are often bought together. So for example, this suggests ways to locate items within stores, right? Put the things that people are buying together, put them in the same place so they're easier for customers to find. It also involves cross-training employees. So you say, hey, you know, if you're the guy who's in charge of helping people find and evaluate keyboards, which one is going to be good for them, you know what? You should teach that same person to evaluate and upsell customers on controllers, because a lot of people that are buying keyboards are also buying controllers, right? It's the kind of knowledge your sales staff should have. Okay? That's an important thing for something with confidence. Last one is lift. Lift is the increased probability of purchasing Y given that X was bought. So basically, if you know that something is much more likely to be bought in the presence of something else, there's a lift there. Basically, you're saying the confidence is higher than the support. Okay, so a good example, again, keyboards versus controllers, right? In the case of consoles and games, the knowledge that somebody bought a console, that doesn't give any extra lift. There's an 80% chance that somebody bought a game with a console, but there's just a regular 80% chance, you know, if somebody walks into the store and buys something, they're buying a game. Doesn't help you out. But you know, if somebody buys a keyboard, there's a pretty good chance that they're buying something else. Okay, for example, a controller is a good one. 60% chance, whereas only 30% of the people are actually buying controllers generally. So the fact that somebody bought a keyboard actually doubles the probability that they're going to buy a controller as well. Yes? Of lift. It is the increased probability of purchasing Y given that X was bought. Okay, so the example here with the keyboards, if I know nothing about the customer other than that they bought a controller, 30% chance that some random customer is going to buy a controller. But if I know that they bought a keyboard, and the way this data is set up, there's a 60% chance that they bought a controller. So the fact that somebody bought a keyboard tells me information that they're much more likely than average to buy a controller. Okay, that's what lift is. You have a higher probability that somebody's going to buy something, right? They're going to buy Y, the controller, given that they bought X, the keyboard. Okay? So you should understand those definitions, basically be able to apply them. Okay, so support, again, simply the probability that two items are bought together. So if a lot of transactions involve items A and B, they're always bought together. Like say at McDonald's, let's say the most popular menu combination is a Big Mac and fries. Like 60% of people go to McDonald's and they buy that. That has pretty high support. Confidence is the conditional probability. For example, suppose I know that at McDonald's almost nobody buys fries alone, right? You buy a burger or a fish sandwich or a McChicken or whatever, and then you buy fries to go along with it. So the probability that somebody bought a Big Mac, right, given that X, the Big Mac was bought, there's a higher probability that the fries will be bought. So if I know that somebody bought a Big Mac, maybe it's like 80% probability that they buy a fries with it, right? Although, you know, you have a few people that are watching still going to McDonald's, but watching their weight somehow. So maybe they skip out on the fries. Okay? And the lift is the increased probability of purchasing Y given that X was bought. So if normally 60% of random people going to McDonald's are buying fries in some transaction, and I know that if somebody buys a Big Mac, there's an 80% chance. Okay, lift is usually expressed as a ratio. So I know that the probability of purchasing Y, it would be 80% divided by 60%, or one and a third, right? 133%. That would be the lift. Okay? That's how those three work. All right. Next thing, clustering. Okay, so the idea with clustering is basically you map all your data to some kind of multi-dimensional polygon, and you try to essentially draw a line through it so that most of the things on one side of the line are the same kind, and most of the things on the other kind are the same line. So I'm going to lift this. I'm going to lift that particular image there because it's easier to work with in Paint. Okay. So if we're doing clustering, the example I have in here is a scholarship. So let's draw a line that catches most of the blues and not many of the reds. Okay, so we're going to try to do it like this, something like this. We'll lift that up a little bit. We'll tip you down. We'll try to catch that last blue. All right, that's pretty good. We can live with this. Okay. So, however we're mapping the variables that describe it. We're saying this side, this is way too big, this font, and dial it down to 20. Okay. This side of the line, this cluster, good prospects for graduation. Okay, so blue indicates, blue means does graduate, red means does not graduate. Right? Because with the scholarship, one of the things is you want to give money to people that are actually likely to finish the program. It kind of looks better that way. All right, on this side, right, this side of the line, low prospects for graduation, right? We can see most of the dots are red over here. I mean, there's one blue one, he might surprise us. There's a few red ones over here, but this is a pretty good single line split of the data, okay? Does that much make sense? Okay. So, let's walk through the problem a little bit. So, scholarship program wishes to grant awards only to students likely to graduate. And suppose that they've crunched all their numbers and they found some data and they found strong positive correlations for three things: high school GPA, high school attendance, and participation in extracurriculars. And when we go to this map here, each of these three axes, right, these three dimensions on this cube are one of those variables. So the people that are out here at this corner, they're pretty high in all those. People that are down here at this corner, pretty low in all those. Okay? So that's fundamentally what it is with clustering. You have all that data in a single box and you try to identify subgroups of it that say, oh, all of this on this side is like this, all of it on the other side is like the other case. That's what clustering is. So clustering is actually a simple case of what I'm going to follow up with trees. So suppose you have a similar problem. Bank wants to minimize the risk of loan defaults, and it wants to do it by filtering, somehow analyzing the risk. So suppose the bank has crunched all these numbers and determined that the main factors involved are income, debt-to-income ratio, work history, and age. And for some groups of customers, those factors might be different. Okay, so here, we're applying the same set of standards uniformly to everybody, right? The same three variables, we're measuring everybody on those, and we're coming up with one solution that divides it all into clusters. With trees, you can apply those variables differently to different data groups. So basically, if you were going to map it to a structure like this, you'd have some kind of potentially crazy irregular polygon, possibly with pockets within, one side or the other that were different. Okay, so tree analysis, for example, you might do something like this. You might say, okay, the first break that we see a significant change is high income versus low income. And they happen to observe that the high income loan recipients are much less risky than the low income loan recipients. Now, within income, they still find, some of the higher income people, they still default. And they identify the main risk factor there as debt to income ratio, DIR. So if their debt to income ratio is less than 0.5, they might say they almost never default, so they're green, so go ahead, lend them the money. If their debt-to-income ratio is high, right, again, greater than 0.5, they might say, wow, that's a real problem. These guys are really risky. We don't want to loan anything to them because they're probably going to go blow it all at the casino. On the other hand, different set of rules come up for people with lower income. So one of the things they might find, even though somebody has low income, relatively low income, if they have more than 10 years of work history, the bank, happens to have looked at the data and said, wow, we've noticed that people who have a long work history, even though they're lower income, they're responsible, they tend to be very good loan risks, so we can safely loan them the money. On the other hand, people with less than 10 years work history, maybe we've identified some of those as a problem. For example, if you're like 60 years old and you've only ever worked 5 years of your life, chances are you don't have all your shit together, right? I mean, there could be exceptions, but chances are. On the other hand, if you're younger than 28, there's a good chance that you're not going to have 10 years of work history, right? Maybe you had time in school where you were working, or who knows what. Maybe you're just 21 years old, and even though you're asking for a loan, there's no practical way with the state's current labor laws, there's no practical way you're going to have 10 years of real work history at that point, okay? So the bank crunches all those numbers, and they essentially figure out, these are the factors that are different. So in tree analysis, you can sequentially apply different variables to split the data. Basically, you're doing a cluster analysis sequentially. Okay? All right. Questions on any of that? Does that all make sense? Yes?
So in a way, the tree analysis basically just divides up, like for this example, divides up people based on their income and how much they work and like if they're...
Yeah. You sequentially do it. So, for example, if we were going to, I'm going to pull up that slide because I can do the same kind of thing here in Paint. Okay? So, if we're doing this, right, this is our mapping, right? In a cluster analysis, let's suppose this is our whole pool of customers and we're going to represent it as, in a square. Customer, loan applicants rather. In cluster analysis, you would basically draw one line or one curve through the data and try to capture as many as possible on one side or the other, okay? But what we can do here is we can split it in various ways, right? So we can have the first box be, this one is pretty good, right? High income. So we'll just call that high income. But there's a pocket in there, however it's mapped out, right? There's a pocket in there where we say, nope, high debt to income ratio, bad. Likewise, over on this side, we can say that, well, you know what? A lot of the people on the lower income side tend to be more risky. So maybe, we got to be careful with that. But there are pockets of goodness over here, right? So for example, if somebody has long work history or, okay, or, less than 28, okay, even though age, right, is generally, right, not work history. Let's mark this in. Okay. So I'll say less than 10 years work history. There's a different mapping, right? You're not just going to go with like one line through the whole pile of data and come up with that. You're sequentially dividing the data into, because if everybody was low risk, then the whole box would just be green and there'd be nothing to split, right? But here you're going to look at it and say, okay, high income people, yeah, maybe we get like 80% over there are good. Low income, maybe we get like 30% of them are good loan risks. So we split the data there. And then within those, you apply maybe different sets of variables to filter out the high risk from the loan risk. So in high income, you recognize the debt to income ratio as a problem. You don't really recognize it over here as being a problem because your data, for whatever reason, hasn't shown that. Okay, so essentially it's like cluster analysis, but there's sequential steps, so it's a little bit more sophisticated. Okay? All right. All right, last thing, we're going to take a minute. So one of the things that you guys may not be aware, in the last 20 years or so, right, so you guys have heard of Enron, right? Yeah, famous. I've mentioned it in the last lecture, I think. So yeah, Enron famously crashed and burned due to lack of ethics. And one of the things that a lot of business programs around the country noticed, 15 years ago when all that was going down, is they said, wow, our business schools are really teaching students to be ruthless. There's not, it's all about chasing money, and there's very little about basically being decent human beings or otherwise ethical. So every course tended to have this little module of business ethics inserted. And I'm going to follow along with that. So where I bring it in is with data mining. So one problem that can happen is with model building, right? Whoever pulls the strings to determine how the model is built has a lot of leeway to decide what factors are going to be included. For example, what variables will be selected, what variables will be excluded, and how relatively important the data variables are, and what the historical window, how far back in time you're going to look at what data, okay? All those, depending on, what you'd think that ideally the people that implement these systems are neutral, but people are very rarely neutral, right? It's not in humans' nature to be neutral. For example, if you're administering a scholarship program, you probably have some idea in your head about the sort of people you want to receive that scholarship. And so if you run the numbers and it turns out, oh wow, the people that are getting it aren't matching, the intended candidates for it, there's a human tendency to try to tip the process one way or the other. So we can fairly ask the questions, is it enough that predictions are accurate? So number one, You can have a data mining system, right? Something like this. If we develop a clustering and you draw a good line through it, let me see, I can unzip this. Okay? You can come up with a pretty good predictive model for this. And nobody's going to say, hey, yeah, that's a pretty good predictor, right? You got, yeah, most of the blue on this side, most of the red on that side. It's tough to argue with the basic logic of it. However, number one, these kind of models, they inherently exclude individual differences, right? Somebody might have some factors that override it. So let's consider cluster analysis for a second. What are some things that basically you want to give the scholarship to somebody who's responsible and is likely to graduate? Okay? What are some reasons why a person might have GPA, relatively low GPA, but still be responsible and have their shit together? No. Specifically about GPA, right? What is something that basically wouldn't really reflect badly on a student, but they might still have a GPA, that might cause a bad GPA? Yeah. Okay, yeah, suppose they have a very demanding job. That's possible. We'll come back to that. What else? Like what? Okay, possibly, right? I mean, death in the family probably wouldn't kick them out too much for their grades, but possibly. I was going to say a medical condition, right? Suppose like your junior year of high school, you get cancer and you spend like 6 months doing chemo and shit and you're not really going to school every day, right? Yeah, that's probably going to negatively affect your grades. But, by the time you're done with college, yeah, maybe that all affects it, right? Or maybe... what else? I don't know. Maybe your parents are going through a really nasty, shitty divorce, and instead of being able to stay in one place, right, you get shuttled back and forth between your parents, between other relatives. Maybe you're in foster care for a couple months, right? That kind of stuff will fuck up your grades, okay? And not really the student's fault. What else? High school attendance? Yeah, same kind of stuff, right? Especially illness. It's not like you're skipping school, but again, if you're going to chemo every day for 6 months, or not every day, it's not really an everyday thing, but you know what I mean. You're kind of messed up. What else? Extracurriculars, right? So when people think about extracurriculars, right, usually they're thinking of stuff like sports or music or academic-ish things like chess club, math team, whatever. But what's something that might even be better than that? That's not a true high school extracurricular. Job is one thing, right? What else? Yeah. Sure, right? That would be a good thing. What else? Charity work, maybe, right? That could be something. Not really going to show up on your high school transcript, though. Okay? So these kind of factors, what I'm saying is you can build a model that's still pretty good, but it's not going to capture everything. And it's hard to build a model that captures everything, but you should allow some leeway in your application and evaluation process for this sort of problem. Okay? So anyway, that's my takeaway from all that, is that humans are fallible, and therefore you shouldn't ever consider data mining to be the last word on something, because the model building, there's so many different factors to include. The question of which variables to include and which not to include is inevitably decided by humans. Okay. So good. So that's a good break point. And then